to WLT Book Buzz. I'm Bowie.
I'm Lauda, and we're both former interns at WLT and self-professed book lovers.
We currently work at Penguin Random House and also love to travel in our free time when we're not reading, of course. So this show is meant to exemplify and uplight diverse voices in literature, and we just can't wait to get started.
So each episode, we're going to highlight one book across different age categories: picture book, middle grade, YA, and, the occasional adult or graphic novel. And, we might not be able to help ourselves. We might have to do some honorable mentions because how can we recommend just one book?
So this month's theme is
Summer reading.
We're hoping to spend the summer learning about a part of history you didn't know about, and this was inspired by WLT Spring Issue. The cover story was Redeeming Dreamland, and it had 21 writers and artists reflecting on the Tulsa Race Massacre. There also was a special section about Chinese migrant workers as well too, and so there's just so much history that oftentimes we do not know about when we think about world cultures and diversity, and so we thought this summer we could dive into that.
Sure. I know that when I've read, there's tons of books, it can be a form of escapism. It can also be a way to learn more about the world and even parts of, the world or history that have already passed. So in case you didn't know, 1921 is when the Tulsa Race Massacre happened. And so it's been 100 years. The issue kind of brought to light some people talking about the past. They featured poetry, nonfiction, creative nonfiction, fiction. But actually my favorite piece in here was Writing History and Covering Truths by Jewell Parker Rhodes. And she actually published a book called Magic City, I think 24 years ago. And it's just so interesting to kind of see how receptive people are to history or not receptive to history. But in light of recent circumstances and Black Lives Matter movement, and just the civil rights things that we've seen in the world around us, this book is being reissued. But it's very interesting to kind of see the nuances of gatekeeping and how, some parts of history are, popular, or some parts of history are being more reimagined. So if you have a chance, you should definitely check out the issue and read some aspects and some ways that people are remembering this historical event.
Yeah, and if you, Jewell Parker Rhodes is an amazing author. She writes a lot of young adult and middle grade as well, and I think she tends to weave in historical parts and pieces that you don't know. So when I think about her book, Black Brother, I learned a lot about fencing history that I did not know about, and about even the fact that Alexander Dumas was actually a Black man, and his dad was considered the Black Count, and some of that history. She has a book that's also talks a little about Emmett Till, and so I feel like she loves weaving in history into her book. So that's a great way to learn about maybe things that you did not know about, is through an author like her.
Truly, though. But in light of this issue and the 100th anniversary, we decided to read more books about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I frankly did not know nearly as much as I feel like I should have. But we read a picture book, a YA novel, and I read an adult novel as bonus, just because can't stop, won't stop. But we read Unspeakable, The Tulsa Race Massacre by Carol Boston Weatherford. We also read the YA novel was Dreamland Burning by Jennifer Latham. And then the adult novel that I read was The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice by Scott Ellsworth. So I don't know if you want to kick us off onto anything.
Yeah, I thought Unspeakable was beautiful. It's covering definitely a very hard topic, but I felt Carol Boston Weatherford did a great job explaining the logistics. What I love actually the most is she starts out with the glory of what, the Greenwood neighborhood was like, and just getting a chance to think about, here are the places and the people that you would have seen, and the laughter and the life, and then talks about the massacre that takes place, and then ends with, again, that sense of hope and joy as they rebuild what was lost now, and as they celebrate and look towards the future to hopefully have reconciliation and a sense of joy. And so not forgetting the hard things, but also recognizing that we can move beyond that and, use that moment of memory to forge us to a better future. And so I just thought it was really beautiful. And the artwork as well, I think captured that so well. It was like little mini murals on every single page that was just beautiful to look at.
I know. And I think that there's something to be said for being able to capture a hard moment in history, but do it beautifully, but also do it in a way that's educational, but not so heavy handed that, you know, like you wouldn't want to share. So like, you got to go read this book if you haven't read it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people worry about, oh my gosh, are my kids too young? Are my kids too young? And personally, I believe you're never too young. At the end of the day, some child who was 2, 3, or 4 years old was experiencing this at that time, and that they did not, no one asked, are they too young to experience watching violence and my house burning and my neighborhood burning down around me? And so I do think there's opportunities to introduce kids to hard topics and begin the conversation around some of the things that happen in the world. And I think this book does it in a way that is very safe and not too overwhelming, but still ultimately allows that dialogue to happen. What did you think about Dreamland Burning?
Okay, so it's part mystery, part historical reimagining. It's set both in present day and then also the past. And so those two interwoven sections of the novel, like it definitely had several twists that I didn't see coming.
Yes. I thought you figured it out and then I was wrong.
I know, same. You know, I was like reading it and I was like, ooh, I see what you're doing. And it was very subtle, you know, in the sense that they were like leading you to subtly what you thought was going to be something. And then bam, not true. I mean,
my mind probably 4 times.
Yeah.
Or like, I was just like, oh, I know what's happening here. I was like, but I don't mind. It's still beautiful. And then I'm like, oh, it's not that after all. And it's just like it just kept on changing.
Yeah.
And then even when I had it figured out, there was still a twist again that you're like, wait, what?
Yeah. Which, you know, as you can tell, we are being very non-spoilery because we want you to read the book.
Yes.
But it was definitely one of those that I read, I forget, like in 1 or 2 sittings, just because
it was a 1 sitting read for me. I sat down that afternoon and I just read it straight through. And I think what I love about what Jennifer Latham is also doing is she's kind of questioning what does it mean to be a witness to events, and what does it mean to speak out about events and to be willing to be a witness and to carry the hard and the heavy things and to be the witness for those things in order for change to exist and to happen. And so there's almost this sense of, you know, do you stay silent? Do you speak up? What do you hide? What do you reveal? And that's something else that is kind of like, you know, both characters in both the past and present are wrestling with, and that we're left to kind of also sit with at the end, like, you know, and I just thought that was a really thoughtful way to think about history and what is, you know, going back to Jewell Parker Rhodes' essay, something that she talks about is like oftentimes history disappears because either there's an act of erasure or we just stop talking about it slowly. And then it's like we forget. And we should never forget, especially when it is these things that we don't want repeating.
Yeah. And I think that like another thing that I was impressed by was kind of like the duality of the main character, in the sense that she did identify as Black, but she also had a lot of privilege. And I don't think that that's something you see a lot in books, you know, in the sense of like there's so many layers, you know, people aren't just like one thing or one aspect.
Yeah.
And so to see her wrestle with that and then also have her friend kind of call her out on some of those aspects, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that is, you know, there are a lot of dualities of people, or even not even dualities, but, you know, like, I don't know what the word for multiple dualities is.
Yeah.
Is blanking.
I mean, we are multitudes, as the poet says, right? So
multifaceted. But yeah, so I was very intrigued. I can say that The Groundbreaking is a nonfiction piece, and it was also actually pretty riveting for being like a historical narrative and talking kind of along the lines of the author's journey, in the sense of like learning more about the truth behind the massacre, and then also talking to eyewitness accounts and like how he's been working on this since like the 1960s and 70s.
Wow.
Please don't fact check me,
but I mean, for a long time.
yeah, you know, and then the fact that you know, like they're still working on unearthing some of the remains and bodies of people and like the mass graves. And that happened like in October 2020, like that they were doing this sort of thing. So that was a fascinating read. But I don't know if Bunmi, you wanted to talk a little
Yeah,
bit.
I mean, I had a bonus. I had read Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson a while ago, and it's not specifically about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but the central character, her family actually migrates to New York City as a result of the Tulsa Race Massacre, because a lot of people chose to leave the city and not return. And so, and what's interesting is, you know, that's also a piece of a little bit of even like the, you know, Great Migration and some of those other things. A lot of that type of violence connects to that. And so there's a whole thread of the story, and also a little bit of a mystery happening in Red at the Bone that reveals itself, but it's all connected to that story that happened, and the girl's ancestors and basically her mom and her grandparents' memories about what it was like to escape from Tulsa at that time. And so I thought it was really, there's a beautiful chapter that when she describes the family remembering, it's just such a, you know, poignant image of what it might have been like to be someone fleeing at that time. And so I just wanted to throw that in there, that if you're looking for something a bit more fiction that's on the adult side, Red at the Bone would be a good option to pick up. Now, we decided to also just kind of like dive into other parts of history we did not know beyond the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so we have a few recommendations for you, picture books all the way up to adult, about some of our favorite books that taught us about things we did not know before. Do you want to kick us off?
So the book that I wanted to talk about is in the picture book category, and it's called The Oldest Student, How Mary Walker Learned to Read by Rita Lorraine Hubbard and illustrated by Oge Mora. And it's basically about this person who learned to read when she was 116. And it's this beautiful picture book. The illustrations are amazing, but it's just kind of crazy, you know, in the sense that like this person was born, Mary Walker, was born into slavery in 1848, you know, and then it kind of like recounts her journey and like, you know, her life and all these kinds of things. And then, you know, like at 114, she's the last person remaining of her family, you know, and she's like, you know what? I never learned to read, so I'm going to do it. And I just think that like, it's just a really touching story, but it's also kind of cool to see highlighted this person in history and kind of like all of the things that they overcome, and that also like you're never too old to learn like a new skill. Or
yeah, I think that sounds beautiful. I've been seeing this because I love Oge Mora as an illustrator, and I've been meaning to pick up this book. And so now it's been moved up to my list. I did not realize 116. Oh my gosh, first of all, how do you live that long, and the stories that she might have? I hope someone, when she learned how to read, she also wrote down memoirs or something, because I would love to hear more about the 116 years that she remembers. That's like,
I know. It was pretty amazing. And then I have a few honorable mentions. Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History. Paper's Son, the inspiring story of Tyrus Wong, immigrant and artist. And The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist. So those are my picture book recommendations. But
awesome. I'm glad you brought up Vashti Harrison, because I think her books are divine, and I mean, there's tons of options, you know, both women and men that you can learn about in Black history that I think I love. So my picture book recommendation is The World is Not a Rectangle, a portrait of architect Zaha Hadid, a portrait of architect Zaha Hadid, written and illustrated by Jeanette Winter. And I am not really necessarily into architecture exactly, but I do think buildings are beautiful, and I always have thought about the creation of books. And so when I saw this, I was very curious about, you know, who is this Zaha Hadid person? And it's just, you know, traces through this young girl who's growing up in Baghdad, and ultimately it's just you looking at the surroundings around her, the way the sand, you know, moves across the desert, the way that marshes, and, you know, there's these houses that are built within the marshes, the way that the waves move. Like, she just looks at nature, and she loves to build things and create things, and decides to become an architect. And all of her work is important for her, for it to beautify like enhance the nature around it, and not be like a box and a ugly whatever. And she's like, why do we need corners? Like, ugh, like corners are stupid. You know, she just is this person who, that creativity. And it chronicles how she actually is rejected over and over again. Some because, oh my gosh, she's Muslim and she's Middle Eastern. Some because she's a woman. And at the time, like, what do you want a woman is? And even when she gets in the industry, she's like, fashion matters. And so she will dress with flair and she has her fancy outfits and shoes and is like, we're not going to be boring. And, you know, she just is like, the world is not rectangle and I refuse to be rectangle myself. And so not only her artwork, but what she created, but also what she did. And I think what I loved about how this Jeanette handles it is, you know, she uses such sparse words to explain like what inspires Zaha with each of her artworks, and you have to kind of guess where the places are. But at the end, she does tell you where the places are, which is really cool to be like, oh, and I've never been to any of them. And so now I kind of have on my list of things to do is like, I need to go visit Zaha Hadid like architecture spots, because some of them are breathtaking, even just in illustrations alone. So I can only imagine what they look like in person. And so that's my, you know, just knowing about this woman who is a pioneer in architecture, and a lot of buildings, beautiful buildings around the world are because of her genius, is something that I just thought was cool. And I believe that she actually designed one of an art museum actually here in the US too, which I thought was really cool, because I know a lot of her buildings were not in the US. She mostly worked out of London, but there is at least one building of hers here. And so I'm definitely curious to see that one day. Some of my honorable mentions is another book about Zaha, because I ended up reading two just because I was so fascinated by her, which is called Building Zaha, and that's by Victoria Tentler Krylov. Drum Dream Girl by Margareta Engel, which is poetry, but it's actually based about the first Cuban drummer. Girls were not allowed to drum in Cuba, and then she was like, no, I'm gonna drum. And it was like, it's very beautiful. And then I Am Not a Number, which this is, you know, we were just talking about the mass graves in the Tulsa race riot. Well, a massacre, but, you know, we also found mass graves in Canada recently at a former Native American resident school. And this book is actually kind of about the fact that about a Native American family who was taken away from their parents to go to the resident school, and one of the kids being I'm not a number, and like refusing to go by a number and really want to hold on to their name and their language and that experience. And that's just a very beautiful book. All right, ready to go on to middle grade?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, well, I'll kick off this time, and I'm going to recommend The Night Diary by Veera Hirandani. And I love this book. I can't even begin to explain how much I love it. I actually read it with a bunch of middle schoolers who loved it just as much as I did, and it was so great to like talk to them about this. So, you know, it's set during the partition in India, which basically when the British Empire decided to start, you know, getting rid of its empires, it gave India its independence, and this ended up leading to the division of India from Pakistan as two separate countries, because you had the Hindus and you had the Muslims who had different views about what their lives should look like and what their country should look like. And it follows, you know, a young girl and her family as they decide what to do. She happens to be actually half Muslim and half Hindu, but her mother is no longer alive. So and as they have to leave what is now Pakistan to go to India, she's wrestling also with, what does that mean for my identity? Am I leaving my mother behind? Why is it that my neighbors are suddenly not my neighbors anymore? You know, and she just is trying to figure out like, what does it really mean to be me? It's written as a diary, partially because the main character actually is a very quiet person who, in a sense, doesn't have a voice, and the writing is giving her a voice. And you can see how her voice gets stronger and she becomes more confident in herself and just her understanding of the world, even as some really, really hard things happen to her. I had no clue about the partition. I did not actually know that that's why Pakistan and India are kind of related, but not related. And I had no clue that there was so much, you know, death and violence and, you know, just I mean, it basically was a religious war in a sense, where people would just start attacking people once they knew that you were a different religion of them, as they were trying to relocate from one side of the former country to another side of a former country. And while this was fictional, I just was so captivated by what I learned about that part of India's history and Pakistan's history. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful read. I did have some honorable mentions as well, just because, you know, we can't stop at one. I do want to recommend the She Persisted chapter book series. They're relatively new, but they basically take the Chelsea Clinton picture books and break them out to chapter books. And so you get one per woman. It's amazing. One Crazy Summer by Rita Williams Garcia, which I learned a lot about the Black Panthers that way. I didn't know much about them. And so this was a really great book for that. And then Caminar, which is set in 1981, Guatemala, during the like communist guerrilla war, and just a little boy who's trying to figure out his place there. And I just felt like, again, I learned about new places and new people, and I loved all three of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I can also say that like my middle grade series, or my middle grade selection is When Stars Are Scattered by Victoria Jameson and Omar Mohammed.
I love this one.
It's literally, I read it in one sitting. It's so beautiful. I cried. The story, you know, is set in
Somalia.
Yeah.
Well, they're from Somalia, but it's set actually in a refugee camp in Kenya.
Yeah. And it was like only like 5-10 years ago. It's like, it's crazy because like when you're reading it, it feels very much like not part of like what I experienced growing up, and just to like read this story of perseverance and brotherhood and like the lengths that this boy would go to protect his family. It's just like, it's truly beautiful. And it just like kind of breaks your heart for like how other people live in other parts of the world. And the fact that it's like based on a true story, it has a happy ending. And you know, he's still going on and doing, you know, like parts of his life and like bringing awareness is just beautiful. But I could not recommend it enough. I've bought it and given it to people as gifts because I just think the story is beautiful. I have 2 honorable mentions because, you know, of course we have 20,000 books. We wish we could sit here and talk about them forever. But Amal Unbound, it's a great middle grade novel, very heavy topic, you know, kind of talking about modern day enslavement, especially in girls. It's kind of a heavy topic, but it's not a heavy read. Also does it like beautifully. And then Before the Ever After by Jacqueline Woodson, which is kind of talking about like the cost of sports, specifically, and like kind of like what it does, you know, the cost of professional sports on Black bodies. I don't know if I explained that one nearly as beautifully as the book is because it's told in verse, and it just like has a lot of nuances and talks kind of, you know, about like traumatic brain injuries and, you know, like the effect that it has on people and kind of like the science behind it that we haven't fully explored. And I think it's set in like the 1990s, but it's something that wasn't talked about then, but is talked about now.
Yeah, I learned so much from all 3 of these that you just mentioned as well too. I loved all of them. I'm glad that you recommend them because I wanted to recommend them. So yay!
I know, it's really cool because sometimes Ruby and I have like the same opinion about stuff, which, you know, is only serving to probably, you know, our own egos. But maybe we just have really great book taste. I'm just gonna go with that.
Yeah, I agree.
So the book that I chose for my YA selection is Punching the Air by Edie Zabai. And it is a novel told in verse. I believe it came out this year or last year, came out pretty recently, but it's told in verse, and it's from the point of view of Yusuf Salam as one of the exonerated 5, you know, kind of like what it's like to be wrongly incarcerated. And it's just like, it's, you know, it's very powerful in the sense that like it talks about like all the feelings and emotions, but it does it in such like an amazing way through poetry and verse. And it's still like, it's kind of like a gut punch, but like in the best possible way, because you just are reading it and you have to like sit with these feelings, but also kind of like see it from the perspective. You feel like you're really going through it and seeing it from their eyes. And it just like, it stuck with me for a really long time. And after I read it, I just kind of had to sit and process for a little while. But my 3 honorable mentions for YA history that I didn't know are The Light in Hidden Places by Sharon Cameron, which is, you know, a real life story about a girl who hides 13 Jews in her apartment in World War II. Codename Verity, another World War II novel, but, you know, it's like spy and friendship, you know, and drama. Great novel. And then Literally Anything by Ruta Sepetys, which I think is a good way to segue to Bunmi, who is going to highlight her
because I chose Ruta as mine. And I was like, when you were like, when you said that, I was like, hey, that's my person. You can't do that. But I'll go ahead and mention her books. The one that actually got me first was Between Shades of Grey, which there's a movie out that they changed the name because, of course, there's an adult novel that got really confusing. But, you know, this was first, Between Shades of Grey, and it is beautiful. And it's another World War II, so we're hanging out in World War II a bit here in YA. But what I loved about it is I feel like a lot of World War II novels are set in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
That I've read. Sometimes they're set in the US, like Pearl Harbor, or and this was the first time that I was reading a World War II novel that was actually in the Soviet Union, and also looking at kind of what was happening with the Soviets and how the Soviets were being involved. I think we sometimes think about World War II as Germans and Japan versus the US, and I think we completely forget about the Soviet Union's involvement and in it. And that's something that I remember I was reminded of when I was reading about, some Asian stories a while back. And now I remember with Between Shades of Grey. And so there was concentration camps and work camps as well too. And this is about a girl and her family who basically get taken to a work camp in Siberia, and the hardship of life and just the fight for survival that they go through. And then Ruta has tons of other books that I think, honestly, they're all historical. She only writes historical fiction as far as I'm aware of. And so far, she has nailed every single one of them, and really invites you into this world and into this time and into this period. And you just feel you're just immersed in it. And you walk away feeling like you lived in that time period yourself and lived through these experiences yourself. And it always is about a part that I'm like, I did not know that happened. Like, I've studied this part of history, but I had no clue that happened. And so I just love Ruta for that reason.
I will.
My honorable mentions. One is Orange for the Sunsets by Tina Athaide. And this is actually about Indian Ugandans. And just like actually when Idi Amin took over Uganda and actually kicked out all the Indians who lived there, but they had thought as far as they're concerned, they are Ugandans. And I did not know there were Indian Ugandans or Indians that identified as Ugandan until I was reading this book. And I thought that was really cool to learn about that. Persepolis, which is actually a graphic novel in 2 parts by Marjane Satrapi. And this is set during the Iran Revolution. And, when you think about the movie like Argo, we think about the U.S., hostages, but there's so much more that was going on. And there's also context with what was the US's role in some of that as well, that I thought was great. And then another graphic novel for me, Brazen, Rebel Ladies Who Rocked the World. And I think that name tells you everything you need to know, is you're going to learn about a lot of amazing women who rocked the world.
Truly. I've read, I think, both of the graphic novel versions, and they were definitely very eye-opening, because they just are showcasing parts of history that are just, not as well known about.
Yeah, there were so many women. I was like, I want to know more about her. Why is there not a picture book or a long form book or something about this woman?
Yeah, it just really showcases who writes history. And you're like, ooh.
Indeed. Well, we're going to start wrapping up now with adult novels, and I'm going to just share one that I read a while ago. I'm not a big nonfiction reader, but occasionally I'll find a nonfiction book that just blows me away. It reads like fiction, and it's just like, man, this is as smooth as butter. And for me, that was The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. We talked a little about the Tulsa Race Massacre at the beginning of this. This is specifically focusing on the Great Migration, which happened over, I think, 2 to 4 decades of, U.S. history. Actually, probably even longer than that, actually, if I'm being honest, because she actually has there's 3 characters she follows who are real people, and one of them, ends up migrating to New York, one of them migrates to Chicago, and one of them migrates to the San Francisco, LA area. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. I think he actually does both, but which are the 3 main areas that Black people were going to during the Great Migration as they tried to escape Jim Crow. So it's post slavery, post Reconstruction, but they're still ultimately second-class citizens, and there's lynchings happening, and just so much discrimination that many of them are like, if I can make it up north or out west, I could actually be treated equally, or at least that's what they think. And so they go on to Chicago and New York and to California, and it talks about how they rebuild their lives and some of the struggles that led to them leaving. In one person's case, it literally was, he was being threatened to be killed and so it was like, I jumped on a train in the middle of the night before they can come get me that night or the next morning. And in another person's case, it's like, I want to be a doctor, and I can't practice being a doctor in the South, so I'm going to go out west where I'm going to have the opportunity to do that. And so it's just these beautiful stories about these people. And what's great is that she really met these men and women and talked about them and got to know their families and really dived into their memories. And it's just such a very deep, rich historical account of not just their lives, but also that time period and what's happening in that time period. And I mean, it's definitely a brick, but it's a brick that doesn't feel like a brick when you're reading through it, because you're just so drawn into the stories that are being told, as well as just learning so much more about what are the different historical things that continue to ultimately oppress Black people, and what are the ways they fought for their freedom. And I just remember I just learned so much about even just US history that I was unaware of through this book.
Yeah.
Some honorable mentions for me. I am Nigerian. I don't know if I mentioned that before, and so I'm really interested in African culture and African history. So Homegoing by Ya Gessi is one that I love because it kind of has a dual perspective of what it looks like if, in African history and US history for Black people, and two parallel timelines leading up to the present. And so it's just, from pre-slave trade all the way up to the present. And it was just like a beautiful story. Half of the Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is about the Nigerian Civil War, which as a Nigerian, I did not know we had a civil war until I was like maybe in college, and I was reading something else and I was like, wait, what? But it happened like within 3 years after independence. And so this was a book that really opened my mind and like gave me more information about that, which was great. And then In Order to Live, I think a lot of us are kind of like curious about North Korea. And so this is actually a memoir from a woman who escaped from North Korea. And so it talks about her life there and her escape and just kind of rebuilding her life afterwards. And so those are my honorable mentions.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to me how many parts of history literally are not told or are finding their way into the light now. My adult recommendation is The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State by Nadia Murad. And this is another one of those stories, like on August 15th, 2014, Nadia was captured by ISIS. They killed a lot of people in her village, a lot of her family. And she was taken in as like a sex slave. And it's like a very harrowing story, but it accounts, like what her dreams and aspirations were and like how that was literally stopped and changed at a moment's notice, and kind of like her story of survival and how she got out of the situation and like what she's doing now. But it just like really brings to light the Yazidi population and stuff like that I just didn't know was happening and has been happening in my lifetime, which is just like, it, really made me think about like, ooh, I should be much more aware of like the world at large and like what other people are going through, and like maybe, pay better attention to the news. It is a hard read, but it also, I feel like, is one of those nonfiction books that stayed with me for a really long time. And it changed a lot of my perspective. So it's one that I recommend, not lightly, but also I think that like for the most part, like if you're going to read it, you're going to get something out of it. And then I have two honorable mentions. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. Literally think that everyone should read this book because it just like really examines, like all of our systems, for jailing people and, like kind of what we're doing as a society. And it comes heavy and hard with statistics, facts, analysis, like anything that you would need to kind of like showcase you what is actually going on in America, and some of the racism at play. And then of course, Cast by Isabel Bookerson. I have not read The Warmth of Other Suns yet, but I'm working my way through Cast. I haven't even finished it yet, which I probably should not be admitting. But from what I've read so far, I'm like, I don't know, 75% done. I couldn't not include it because like, as you were saying, like it just reads very effectively. It feels like she's sitting across from me and saying in like such an eloquent and like authoritative, but interesting and engaging way, like this is, like society. This is like all of the things that are happening. These are like the distinctions that you can make.
Yeah. That's on my list for sure, just because I love The Warmth of Their Suns, but I've not yet got into it just yet, but I'm loving it. Can I throw in one more bonus tip, which is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime?
Oh, my goodness.
And I think if you're an audiobook listener, even if you're a non-audiobook listener, which I am not, I listen to this book on audio and it's worth it because he also speaks in many different South African languages. And so you can actually hear what it sounds like. But I think, yes, it's his memoir kind of, but he also actually talks a lot about just the history of apartheid in South Africa in general, and also what it is like to be, that at that time, a half-caste person technically in that space and time, which made him illegal because Black and white people were not allowed to be in relationships. And so it's really interesting to like listen to the ways that his parents navigated being his parents, the way he navigated the world around him. There's a funny story about like him not knowing who Hitler was because like, you know, they weren't learning about European history and didn't understand that stuff. And there's just like, it was just interesting to think about, this is what it could look like to grow up in a different place that's different than mine and from a non-Western context, but also to understand like what led to what South Africa is, that, you know, up until what, 94 or whatever, apartheid still exists. And so I think it's such a great book for that context, but also with a little bit of humor. And there's some hard parts there too, but because he's Trevor Noah, it's funny, and you're going to leave the book just feeling a lot of joy at the end of it. So
no, I read the adapted for young readers edition, and I thought it was great. I need to read the adult version, but
I may try that one out, because I was wondering how many cuss words are in that one, because there's quite a few in the adult one. Not a lot, like not in an off-putting way, but he's definitely going to like throw out some words. Yeah,
for sure. But this wraps up. We have one more section, which is each episode we're highlighting one NSK Newstat finalist. As a reminder, the NSK Newstat Prize for Children Literature has been awarded every other year to a living writer or author-illustrator with significant achievement in children's or young adult literature since 2003.
And so this month we wanted to focus on Laurie Halse Anderson, and she was nominated by Adib Khorram, and he had used the book Shout as her represented text, which is a memoir in verse about surviving sexual assault in about the age of 13, and just kind of the manifestation of the Me Too era. And so that book has gotten a lot of widespread critical acclaim, and that's the book that was chosen to nominate her. But she has quite a few other novels. Two of her books, Speak and Chains, were both nominated for a National Book Award, and they were finalists. Chains was also shortlisted for the prestigious Carnegie Medal in the United Kingdom. Something I want to say about Chains, because it's actually the only book of hers I've read, along with, it's actually a trilogy, and so I've read the first two books, and she took a very long time to come out with the third book. I actually tweeted her about this, being like, woman, when is it coming out? And she's like, it's coming. And I was like, she responded. But anyway, she eventually did come out, and I just need to go back and read it. But Chains is, what I love about it is, when we're talking about histories we don't know, it's looking at the American Revolution from the perspective of a slave. So I think we talk so much about the American Revolution as rah, rah, we were fighting for our freedom against the evil Britons and the power of the king, and we didn't want a monarchy, and not really talking of so much about the manipulation that was happening with slavery there, and how like slaves were not being offered that freedom, but also being asked to fight for the freedom, sometimes on both sides of the war. And you know, it's just about this girl who's like, no, my goal is freedom, period, and I don't care how I'm gonna get it, but I'm getting it. And so you watch her through the three books kind of navigate the American Revolution and play her cards right, in a sense, to ultimately try to get her freedom, because that's all she cares about, is who's giving me my freedom. And it's not own voices, which I know is something that people have a lot of feelings about. And I do believe, from my understanding of just like listening to Laurie speak, is that she definitely did a lot of research and really sat down and had a lot of people read this and like it was vetted, and there's a lot of people who do love this book from all different races. But that's something to be aware of. But what I just loved about it in the first place is that it is showing us a different perspective on history. Even if it's not a different part of history, it was a different perspective that I think was worth paying attention to.
I think one of the other things is, you know, like I've grown up reading Laurie Halse Anderson, and I feel like she's like really plugged into, you know, like kind of some of these not necessarily taboo topics, but topics that are not readily and easily written about in society, but like teens are going through, adults are going through, you know, like sexual assault, you know, eating disorders. I know that I read Winter Girls, and that one had a large effect on me, not because, you know, like I've had an eating disorder or anything along those lines, but to just like see it from that perspective and like see the inside story, and then also like have this account that, you know, you can learn from and kind of like be put in the person's shoes, is something that, you know, like I think that she's really well versed into getting into the minds of teenagers, and then also just like showcasing these heavy, hard topics, but then doing it in a way that resonates with people. So that is obviously why she was nominated. But that's what we've got for you. We hope that you are also reading books about history that you didn't know. As per usual, all of the books that we reference, I know that there's like 20,000, and you are obviously have already been sitting here listening and have added them to your TBR. Good job. But the links and, well, not links, but the descriptions, titles, authors are going to be in the description of this video. But as per usual, if you want to drop a rec in the comments, please feel free to do so. We are always wanting to read more. And if you want to read more from World Literature Today, you can always check them out online at worldliteraturettoday.org.
So until next time, we'll leave you with these parting words of inspiration.
To travel far, there's no better ship than a book, by Emily Dickinson, quote.
And from Jhumpa Lahiri, that's the thing about books. They let you travel without moving your feet. See you next time, and happy
reading!